Thank you. It's a great privilege to have an opportunity to share some ideas with you this morning, or this morning in my context. What I propose to do is to speak to my paper rather than necessarily, read it. And I think part of that is because that when we asked to write our papers, that we were asked to try and limit ourselves to about 5,000 words. And so therefore, what I propose to do now is perhaps to say some of the things that didn't get into the paper, in addition to what is in the paper itself. I think the first thing I would want to say is that I speak as someone who is a liminal person. And by that, I mean that my name is Anthony George Reddie. Reddie, Reddie, is a slave name. That name denotes that at some point in the past, someone white from Europe living on a plantation in Jamaica owned my ancestors. Reddie is a slave name. And Eric Williams, great Caribbean intellectual from Trinidad and Tobago, in 1944 wrote his magisterial book, Capitalism and Slavery, which established that the old world, the old normal, was predicated upon slavery, that without slavery you don't get capitalism, and without capitalism you then don't get the world global order that we've had for the past 5 centuries. And therefore, in both the paper and in this presentation, it really starts from the recognition that we've had 2 pandemics going on. One has been recent in origin, which is COVID-19. But actually, we've had a much older pandemic, which is a pandemic of systemic racism, anti-Black racism in particular, that has been in evidence for a number of centuries. And those 2 pandemics have both been laid bare in recent events in this year, both in terms of COVID-19 and in the murder of George Floyd. It's important to realise that part of the framing, therefore, of the old normal is that sense of people of African descent, particularly diasporan Africans, still essentially being objects and being commodity. And to understand that, it's important to go back to the 1833 settlement. So when slavery was finally abolished in the British Empire, first in 1833, but finally in 1838, in order for us to be free, I think an unholy deal with the devil had to be made. That for centuries, well, certainly centuries, if slightly less than in terms of decades, abolitionists have been arguing that one of the most abhorrent issues of slavery was the immorality of owning another human being, that actually you cannot own other sentient beings. You can own animals, you can own lower creatures in the so-called world order, and of course we won't dispute what we mean by a so-called hierarchy of order. But certainly at the very least, you should not be able to own another sentient being. And yet, in order for us to be free, the abolitionists had to agree that a fee, a sum of money, 20 million, roughly worth about 20 trillion, I guess now in modern money, 40% of the British Exchequer that was only repaid in 2015. That's how large that amount of money was. 1838 to 2015, in order to pay that off, had to be paid in order for us to be free. Therefore, for us to be free, an argument had to be conceded that essentially for us to be free, one had to acknowledge that compensation needs to be made, and therefore there was a price that one could pay, or a price that one could put on our humanity. Therefore, what I argue in the paper is that the collusion of the Christian tradition in this. So it was only very belatedly that Christians, certainly white Christians, began to realize that this was abhorrent, because for centuries they had been happy to collude with that and to enable particular readings of scripture in order to justify our enslavement. But not enslavement, our sense of being objects, being objectified, being chattel, being things and being. It's therefore no surprise that when we look at the new pandemic, in addition to the old one, that the disproportionate deaths have been those same objects, those same things that were deemed to be of lesser worth for centuries under the old order. Incumbent upon this sense of being objectified and the way in which the Christian tradition has often supported that. And so, for example, in the paper, I talk about the Exodus narrative and the ways in which a reading of that, particularly in the book of Joshua, helps to reinforce the notion of conquest of land. Because even if people are there, the fact that they're objects and they're not sentient beings means that there was still a sense of this land being a tabula rasa, even though people were already there and had a relationship with the land for millions of years. Long before George Floyd was murdered, the police officer put his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Back in March 1987, the first march I ever went on was for the death of an African Caribbean man called Clinton McKervin, who died on a roadside, on a pavement outside of a shop in Wolverhampton, a city in the West Midlands, because a number of officers sat on his body with one on his neck for approximately 8 minutes, and he was murdered. And we went on a march, and most white people did not join us. I remember at the time being part of the student Christian movement at the University of Birmingham. And this was a time where the student body was very politicized. So we were very much in solidarity with disenfranchised Black people in South Africa. So it was not uncommon to have students marching outside of Barclays Bank on a Saturday morning in Birmingham to campaign against apartheid in South Africa. Yet when I asked those same students to go on a march with me to Wolverhampton, 16 miles away, in order to complain about police brutality against Black bodies in Britain, not one student came with me. Much more interested to talk about oppression and the old pandemic of systemic racism in a place far away with people you'll never meet, but not quite so interested in supporting Black bodies within the UK. All that to say that central, therefore, to this paper is the sense of a deconstruction of whiteness, a deconstruction of the normality of whiteness that the General Secretary Colin Cameron spoke of in his introduction. It's this sense in which the template for humanity cannot be reduced to one particular type of human being, which is usually a person with white skin, usually with power and privilege economically, which therefore means it's not all white people I'm talking about, but particularly those who have the levers of power and have very much been at the forefront of orchestrating a form of systemic injustice. That they cannot be the template on which humanity is built, in which therefore leaves the rest of us, particularly those of us who are diasporan Africans, has been largely objects for whom a set of statistics around our deaths are simply just numbers on a balance sheet, because our sentient humanity is of limited importance. Therefore, a Black liberation theological critique is a critique of whiteness, a critique of the normality of whiteness. It's a reinstating of our sentient humanity as beings and not objects and chattel. And therefore a resistance to the old normal. A new normal is predicated upon a emancipatory hope that is found within the rereading of the Christian tradition using a post-colonial critique of the existing old order. Therefore, we cannot afford to go back to the old normal, because the old normal was toxic and oppressive. And the new order, hopefully, is one that will be egalitarian, more egalitarian with equity for all people. Thank you.